Hi everybody, I'm RANVIR SINGH. Thanks for coming here and not to Love Island, which is on at the same time over in another room. We appreciate you being here. Thank you so much, of course. So we're here to talk about social mobility within the industry and what that really means, whether, and I think most people agree there probably isn't enough of it, and why that affects our viewers, our viewing figures. It affects people whose careers we may not be exploiting fully and their talents within the industry. And I know I asked you to go on an app, didn't I, a little moment ago, but Sam here, who's going to be talking to you in a minute, says that maybe we could just do a show of hands then. Is that okay? So the question here is, and it might sound like a blunt tool, but it's a known question in these sort of bits of research that people do that we're going to be hearing more about. So the question is, what was the main occupation of the main breadwinner when you were 14? So if you can put your hand up for if it falls into the blue category. So Sam's going to be he asked me to do a percentage. I said that's asking way too much of me and my very mediocre talents. Okay? Yeah. And could you put your hand up if you can answer that question and it falls into the red category? Sam's just having a look. It's much slower. Do you remember when we used to have to dial in before broadband came? It's essentially what we're doing now. We're sort of, it's just dialing in and, yeah, it's very, yeah.
There's a lot of hands going up and then down.
Okay, so hands up for the red. Are you all right? Should we do the green? Yeah, so and hands up if it falls into the green. Can we answer in the green?
Oh, he's supposed to do it though.
Yeah. Okay, so Sam's going to explain what that all means. He's been doing lots of research about social mobility, particularly within the broadcast industry. But we have a brilliant panel here who have all got very particular experiences, successes and other things that may have happened in their careers and how they then change social mobility in everything that they try and do. So if I can just ask from the end, Tom, if you just kick off by just giving a quick hello and who you are.
I'm Tom Davis. I'm an actor, a writer, and now something of a producer, and I'm from the bottom lot. Yeah, that's me.
Camilla.
I'm Camilla Lewis. I'm the CEO of Curve Media. I've worked across the industry. I make programmes for all the channels, and I am in the top one.
Paul?
I'm Paul Coleman, scriptwriter. I'm in the bottom one.
And you wrote CASH?
Yes, wrote CASH, sorry.
Yeah, give us your highlights, that's it. Jazz.
Highlights. I'm Jazz GOWANS. I'm the CEO of Transparent Television. We make factual fact-tent across all the broadcasters. Amy Winehouse, while she was still alive, Botched Up Bodies 9 series, Very British Brothel for Channel 4, and Portillo's Hidden History of Britain, and I am definitely in the bottom one.
And, well, Darren or Loki.
Yeah, I'm Darren McGarvey. I'm a hip-hop artist, a columnist, and recently became an author when I just published my first book last year. And the fact my dad was an electrician for a couple of years is kind of offset by the fact my mother was a bit of a jakeball, so I'll just take my place in the bottom category.
Lovely. Well, thank you all for being here. And thank you all for being here. One gets the feeling that perhaps because you're here, you're already interested in social mobility. So one gets the feeling that maybe we're talking to those who are already aware of it. And I suppose part of what today's session is about changing a lot of mindsets of people who maybe aren't in here. But we're going to be going through lots of different sort of areas of why this matters. Financially, to our viewers, to whether we can really say that we authentically portray the lives of the people in this country. So Dr. Sam Friedman is going to come up onto stage now. And you've been doing lots of research, haven't you, specifically over the last few years on this very issue. Yeah, welcome.
Yeah. Thank you. So I would be paid more if I was posher. Not my words, as you can probably imagine, but those of BBC TV presenter Steph McGovern, who in February went public with her view that the BBC and British television more widely has a profound social mobility problem. Now, when I say social mobility, what I mean is that a person's destination in life, normally measured in terms of their job, is not determined by their origin. Normally defined, as we mentioned before, in terms of what their parents did for a living. And a high level of social mobility is generally considered one of the strongest indicators of a healthy, fair, meritocratic society, a society where no individual is prevented from fulfilling their potential. Now, as a sociologist, I've spent the last decade studying social mobility, and one of the key findings that's emerged from my research is basically that Steph McGovern is right. Even when those from working class backgrounds make it into Britain's most prized occupations, most prized professions, they face a very powerful 16% class pay gap, which significantly is exacerbated intersectionally for women and people of colour from working class backgrounds. But while my data over the last few years has showed a very clear national class pay gap, what about specific industries? What about television? For me, social mobility is especially critical in this industry. You guys are responsible for producing the culture, the stories that shapes how Britain sees itself. So it's pivotal that as a workforce, you represent the diversity of your audiences. But the reality is, until now anyway, we've actually known fairly little about how a person's class background affects their ability to get in and get on in television. So over the last couple of years, I've been working with a range of broadcasters to compile, I suppose, the first sort of comprehensive picture of what the sector looks like. So the data I'm going to show you has two components, really. First, it explores the class backgrounds of staff at Channel 4, at BBC, at ITV, at Viacom, and at many of the TV indies. And second, I've tried to dig a bit deeper to understand the barriers that those from disadvantaged backgrounds face in the industry. And here I conducted an in-depth study at Channel 4, conducting interviews with staff at all levels. So to look at people's backgrounds, we tend in most of the social mobility research to ask this question that we've been talking about today. And this is really, I suppose, the most established single indicator of social mobility, and there are lots of other ways we might cut it up. So based on your answers to these questions, we assign people to one of these three groups in the ONS socioeconomic classification. Did your parents do professional and managerial middle-class jobs? Did your parents do intermediate or skilled manual jobs? We perhaps call this sort of lower middle-class work in everyday life. And finally, did your parents do solidly working-class routine jobs, cleaners, labourers, or were they unemployed? And really, it's these two bottom groups that we're talking about when we talk about social mobility in this country for fairly straightforward reasons. So first, what I did was look at class backgrounds of those working throughout the TV sector. And I think what we found was pretty striking. What this simple chart shows you is that the TV sector, but also by my fairly unscientific calculations of the show of hands earlier, that yourselves are highly skewed towards the privileged. Between 60 and 70% of staff at each of these broadcasters here and in the indie sector, and I think it was about 60% of the people in here are from middle-class backgrounds. Okay, the figure in the population as a whole is 31%. So you see a pretty clear skewing there. Things are more dispersed when we look at those from working class backgrounds. The BBC looking much more diverse than other areas, although it's worth noting that at Channel 4, less than 1 in 10 staff are from working class backgrounds. Next, and perhaps more worrying, we also found a very clear class ceiling in British television. So what this graph does, it shows you the class composition of senior management, okay, across the TV sector. And notably, in most cases, okay, the proportion of those from socially mobile backgrounds drops off considerably as you reach top positions. Okay, just 3 or 4% of staff at the top of Channel 4 are from working class backgrounds. And I should say this trend is particularly acute if you look at the more creative areas of these broadcasters in commissioning, programme making. And it's also, for those interested in other measures, very much shows up in other ways of cutting this up. If you look at private education, for example, you see a big overrepresentation throughout the sector. Two interesting caveats here. We don't see a class ceiling effect at Viacom, and interestingly at ITV, where we only have data on senior leaders, you'll have noticed, the class composition at the top looks much more diverse than the rest of the sector. So I think these are interesting food for thought. But I think taken together, this data sort of underlines the scale of the challenge facing the sector in terms of social mobility. I think in recent years, you've had lots of anecdotal conversation about there being a class issue. I think these results lay bare the extent to which the privileged really dominate the occupation. The obvious question, of course, is why? What's driving this sort of class ceiling effect? I don't have time to go through this in any detail, but I just want to pull out 3 drivers that have emerged from my interviews. First, very clear economic barriers. Okay, to get ahead in TV, as you all know, particularly in what is called the sort of creative route, you need to negotiate a string of precarious, poorly paid, short-term production jobs in the main. Okay, these give you the experience to reach those higher executive positions or to be in the pool to be considered. Many from lower socioeconomic backgrounds explained to me that they simply didn't have the economic resources to follow that route. Okay, and what often had been the case is that they'd sort of grudgingly self-selected out of that route into more stable but less lucrative areas, to admin, to sales, to marketing, to technical roles within the industry. But it's not just about money. I also detected distinct social barriers, in particular a culture of informal sponsorship, where senior individuals in the industry fast-track the careers of sponsees, but tend to establish relationships, I think crucially, with those that they sort of have a cultural affinity with. Okay? Those who they recognise culturally, which tend to mean those from more privileged backgrounds, if we look at who is the incumbents at the top at the moment. Finally, and perhaps most interestingly, I think there are clear cultural barriers. There's a lot to say here. I just want to pick up on one thing, a powerful behavioural code that I've noticed from doing research in television, which I term studied informality. Now, behavioural codes are important in many professions, but they're often relatively formal and involve clear expectations around dress, speech, appearance. Think about the idea of corporate polish, for example. In television, this idea of polish holds little sway. Okay? Most told me that they'd chosen television specifically because there were not formal expectations around dress and appearance, that the culture was informal, and that this was a key sign of TV's openness, where you can be, in the words of one, who you want to be. The more I delved into this informality, though, the more I began to understand that it's not a social leveler at all. It constitutes a very subtle, a very intricate behavioural code. In particular, I identified 2 key dimensions of studied informality. First, it requires a particular package of self-presentation, okay, an RP accent, casual but hip dress. There was a lot of discussion about the right kind of trainers, for example, right? A knowing, often ironic humour, okay? Who knows when to swear in a meeting and when not to? And a level of interpersonal familiarity, okay, hugs and kisses rather than handshakes, that are actually quite unusual in any other sort of professional workplace.
Yeah, true.
Second, though, and I think this is important, particularly for those more creative ends of the business, I found that there's a sort of particular intellectual or highbrow way of talking about television, particularly in commissioning, and perhaps even more particularly at commissioning at Channel 4, where I was doing this work, to sort of drop cultural references from other high art forms, to sort of speak in an arcane or sort of lyrical tone, even though most of us told us that this was often quite irrelevant to the actual programmes being made. Okay?
Yeah.
And unsurprisingly, it was those from low socioeconomic backgrounds that found this cultural norm particularly alienating, particularly intimidating, who struggled to master this studied informality, who, in the words of one interviewee, just don't seem to understand the rules of the game. And this matters in my mind anyway, because it demonstrates how the sort of self-presentational baggage of a privileged class origin, is actually frequently misrecognised in television as a marker, as a legitimate marker of someone's talent, their fit, their potential. So why should you care about this? 2 points to leave you with. First, I think this reveals some pretty uncomfortable truths. Those from working class backgrounds clearly find it very hard to both get in and get on in television, even compared to other leading professions. But second, this is not just an urgent problem in terms of social justice in the workplace. It's also surely relevant to conversations about what kind of telly is being produced in this country. When those making the decisions about what to make or what to commission come from such homogenous social backgrounds, what does this mean for the way different social groups, different class communities are represented or misrepresented on screen? So my research definitively can't answer that particular question, but I hope it can act as a provocative starting point for framing today's panel discussion. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. So let's just kick off then with a bit of personal experience. Does what Sam has said there reflect any of your experience? Should we kick Tom?
Yeah, I guess, my route into this business is probably the weirdest of all. I left school at like 15. I was a scaffolder and sort of came into this quite late. And I never knew what an RP accent was until very recently when I had to do one in an audition. But weirdly...
What's it like? Can we have a little burst of it?
I think it's something like this, isn't it?
Did you get the Posh accent?
No, I didn't. No, the crown hasn't called yet.
Downstairs at Downton Abbey, though, maybe.
There's a chimney sweep in the next series. Who am I kidding? Am I getting that part? I knew that this was a problem, and after speaking to Sam and looking at his research, obviously it's a crazy, the figures speak for themselves. And yeah, I suppose there was always a social climb that I had to jump up. But I'm very proudly working class. I still mix, I still drink with the people that I always have. I think actually weird, I was just saying that I think when I first came to Edinburgh, the first year I performed in Edinburgh, was the first time I ever really noticed the class barrier. When you're a job in stand-up, you're sort of working with people a lot of the time that are from working class backgrounds. But when I came up here and I was doing more character stuff and more surreal stuff, it always felt that there was a little bit of a gap. And I think that's another important thing. I think while we have to represent where we come from. It's important that my story, and I'm working on a thing now with the BBC that is very much about my background, but also we shouldn't just make working class people go, right, you have to write about where you're from. Yeah. Murder and Successful it's a bit surreal, it's a bit out there, and we should allow people from these backgrounds to write about whatever they want. We shouldn't just put them in a little bit and go, that's what you should be doing. Yeah. So yeah.
And Camilla, you sort of agree with that, don't you, in the sense that, you say, look, I'm in the top category,
Yeah. I don't think we should self-berate and sit here beating ourselves up and say, I am this, I've got to pretend to be something else, I've got to, we just need to be very self-aware and check our privilege. And that is primary thing in how we act in the industry. That's as producers. Commissioners and broadcasters have a slightly different role. There's no broadcaster on this panel, but it's interesting to note Channel 4 did publish that research, so they let that research be seen, and I don't think any of the other broadcasters have. So to be fair, although Channel 4 don't come across in some ways brilliantly, they're aware of it and they're trying to deal with it. And I think it's a very, very complex issue of intersectionality, where we have to look at, not just what you are, but also what do you bring to the party. Are you a woman? Is your family from a broken home? There's lots of other issues to bring in about how we make sure that we're relevant. And I think going back to the relevant word, which I think for what Sam was saying rather brilliantly is the word, because it's not just about, are we right on, do we care? I think no one on this panel feels anything other than there should be more working class voices. Off screen, there should be more representation. On screen, some channels, I think ITV1 does a fantastic job with representing this country. I think things like Unforgotten, which I've had the joy of watching back to back in the last week because I've never seen it, and it just deals with great issues in a brilliant way. I think there are brilliant factual programmes, of which, of course, Curve Media make a couple, where we've got black working class women, running a show about cleaning. I think you can do stuff and it's there, and it is happening in some ways. We mustn't beat ourselves up, but we've got to stay relevant because we're in a very interesting marketplace. Only about 40% people at any given night are watching terrestrial television. And that is because there's big global leaders out there like Netflix, etc. And we're going to them for the big brand knockout programmes. They are doing the big shows that are being watched. So what can we offer in the UK? What's our distinctive offering?
What's that? What the hell's that? What the fuck? Oh. Get out quick! There's a monkey on the roof! Come on, get off! Yay!
Oh, it's a little baby one!
Little baby? The bastard will rip your face off, get back!
No, it does. It's a curly whirly. Yes, you do.
Well, give it a curly whirly!
We don't talk about where we're from.
But we need a job.
I'm not saying it's a bad thing.
We need to get paid, and we need to eat and pay our rent, and we want to get in. I don't.
I think there are two different things, though, aren't there? There's kind of like, is television relevant in how what we produce, and are the people working at getting the opportunities they can get?
And also, can you speak up in a meeting and say, if you're the only person in that meeting who says something? I think, you know, I've been in situations, and I know people who have been, I can't say who, but who've been in situations where they've thought, and this is in news, you know, this is in programme making in news, where you go, I felt that was a bit off, or that guest, we didn't push them hard enough, right? Because they're all of a sudden a friend of the programme. Well, they shouldn't be, right? Because of their views affect people like me. But nobody else in that room understands it, because I'm me and you're you. But if you don't feel confident in saying, I feel uncomfortable with that, and that is a class thing. But go on, Loki. So you, I mean, you're not in a broadcast industry in the sense that these guys are making programmes and trying to, but you have a view, don't you, about, from the outside essentially, about what you call, is it poverty porn, you call it in a way?
I've got views about other stuff too.
Share them all.
I'm signed up to do 6-part series about poverty, possibly a talk show, and I've been in and out of broadcasting through the years. Right. So I have got kind of insight in it. Actually, before a lot of this research actually existed, there's a chapter in my book basically hypothesising what all the research now evidences. Yeah. Which is that while intersectionality, as Camilla rightly points out, has been a wonderful way to try and illustrate the complexity and the compounding effect of multiple identity configurations. At the same time, socioeconomic analysis has been left out of it because the theory itself has emerged on Ivy League university campuses. So often what you'll see is when we talk about, you know, the BAME stuff you were saying, when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, what actually happens is it creates space for people from privileged socioeconomic backgrounds of colour.
Completely agree.
You know, and that's still progress. Obviously, that's progress.
Yeah.
But because class is so nebulous, so difficult to discuss and articulate, and because the ravine between those two experiential realities is so formative and divergent, then it means that sometimes even just trying to communicate basic stuff means you get bogged down and feeling misunderstood, people thinking you're being aggressive, people thinking you're being patronising, and the reverse is true. I mean, it's interesting what I think, first of all, just to quickly kind of just tick through some of these things really quickly. We need to start talking about social immobility, not social mobility. Social mobility has been exposed as a myth. How many of these things need to be published to reveal that? So anytime you hear yourself saying social mobility, stop yourself. Stop yourself the way you would stop yourself if you were going to say something casually sexist, if you were going to say something casually racist. That way you've got to kind of go like that now. Hang on, I can't say that shit anymore. Stop saying social mobility. It's like people who instead of using the word nights insist on using the word sleeps because it connects them to something comforting juvenile about themselves. The second thing is, you know, I learned very quickly how to become socially mobile, and I'm actually a lot more socially mobile than a lot of the very wealthy, successful people that I meet, because we misunderstand what social mobility is. We think social mobility is being successful. No, social mobility is being able to work on a building site and then go and sit in a room with TV executives.
Absolutely.
Social mobility is about me being able to leave here and then go for coffee with somebody that's sleeping in the street. So actually there's a certain level of sophistication that requires. There's a certain level of kind of learned experience, but it's not regarded as sophisticated. And funnily enough, that's what's missing from TV land. It's understanding the minutiae and the nuance of not people's commodified identity, right? We live in a capitalist society, woo-ha, brilliant, but it also means when we talk about identity, it's a commodified identity we talk about. So when we go into poorer communities, we're looking at what do they read, what do they wear, what products do they eat, what celebrities do they like. We never look at the cultivated identity of people. What are their values? What do they know? The richness of their life. We see culture on a continuum of ABC ones all over here, listening to Radio 4, loving Jeremy Vine, and then we see people down here as basically kind of agglomeration of distasteful behaviours or social
Jeremy
problems
Kyle.
or illnesses.
Like Jeremy Kyle.
And actually, it's parallel cultures we're dealing with here. So the minute that we start recognising that cross-pollinating these things is not just necessary for us to actually become as cultured and sophisticated as some seem to think we are, but it's also something media need to realise that this is an existential problem for a lot of mainstream media, and I don't think they're quite grasping it yet. More and more people are tuning out because they see themselves inauthentically reflected.
Can I just name some of the... There are some of the...
Sorry, that was a bit of a rant there.
No, that's good. That's what you're here for. But there's some of the programmes that I was given a list of that, you know, how you feel about them. So some of the titles, just the titles. Benefits Britain, Life on the Dole. I don't know, people in here may have made them. I don't know, sorry. On Benefits and Proud, Benefits Too Fat, The Great Big Benefits Wedding. And does that feed into what you're saying there?
Absolutely. I mean, these, if you're trying to have a good faith assumption about what this sort of socially toxic garbage is actually about, then you would have to at least generously say, clearly, people think this is a good idea because they don't know any better. Because it couldn't be that they were deliberately trying to make Britain's most socially toxic problem, poverty, worse, harder to understand.
More alienating.
More alienating, because you know what this stuff actually, see, when a show like that's made, do you know what the real exhibit is? The show itself, the fact that it exists, and the fact that people who make these kind of programmes don't realise that they are the freaks on display. Then that just shows you how much of a bubble media can be. The fact that these programmes exist and they become self-justifying in a way, it's just like a big audience is its own justification. I understand that. People do watch it. But, I mean, we could be doing with a wee bit more meaningful, thoughtful, erudite TV programming where specifically poverty is concerned, because the problem is social inequality, the wealth polarisation, the cultural ravine, what it's doing to our politics, what it's doing to our democracy is really, really dangerous. And actually, if we don't start getting to the roots of it, then, you know, there's a lot of questions about what our society's like, how our society's going to evolve.
I couldn't agree more with you, and I think that this is kind of like, as an argument, I couldn't agree with you more. The whole benefit world, it's very interesting, because what it is, it's about the Daily Mail. It's about, this is the Daily Mail language we're buying into here, because we think we can get audience, we can bring people to it, and we can kind of do them and us, which is what you're sort of talking about, the splitting thing, isn't it? Which is that, oh, I'm not like that, they're like that, those poor people, let's kind of like, it's poverty porn in another way. But and ultimately, that is not acceptable in any way at all. I think that many channels know that, you know, and, you know, Channel 5 has got a great approach towards this and is much more for the people, by the people. Channel 4 would not make the programmes I think it made a few years ago, not because I think it's become self-aware in a good way about those things, but we've got to be responsible for how we represent this country. Otherwise, we become irrelevant. And what you're saying about relevancy is exactly right. I mean, if you watch programmes and all you're seeing is poverty is being seen, that's the problem in the country. I mean, yes, it is, but not in the way that it's being represented. And we should be making programmes for all the people.
What are the good
programmes? Then I think there's the
there?
we. Then I think who's the we?
Yeah.
And who is the we? And that's
the royal we.
On camera and off camera. That's predominantly, as Sam has shown, not working class. So, you know, where are the voices? Where are the, you know, where are the...
There's a clip of your show, isn't there?
Well, I mean, for brothel, for example, it took me a year to get into that brothel. They would never have let me, they would have smelt me a mile off if I had received pronunciation, you know, and not even let me anywhere near it. I think the clip you're about to show is SUPERCAR Superfan, which is on BBC 3 at the moment. And this is a British working class family who just a very aspirational British working class family who just happened to be Asian. And I've never courted Asian programming, and I've never courted BAME programming, but you know, it's sort of like made by a company whose CEO just happens to be Asian and working class. And it's the class thing that united us. We're very different Asians, you know.
But also the family values.
It's the class.
Kind of what Loki was saying. This is about family values in the end. It's not. It's about the money. But should we see a little clip of it actually?
Listen to that. I'm a real life Vin Diesel, innit? What can I say? It's all about having a nice car, showing up people what they can have too if they work hard at it. Mad that we got £1 million worth of cars and we're still living at home. Well, you're stuck here for the rest of your life. What's on the menu, Ma?
I want him to leave home now.
The cars are like a mistress to him.
My brothers be like, oh yeah, let me drop you, and be like a Bentley or something like that. I'd be like, no. I said, I'd rather walk in the rain.
I'm doing this because you don't have a wife.
He always says that Sundays were spent at home.
Yeah, have the chicken. Just the chicken part.
Is it okay?
It's really nice, Papa. Yeah, really nice.
I mean, it's his. I mean, his whole mission in life is to get them out of the house. You know, but it's, you know, and that's what makes him Asian, really. But it's but it's about. But it was all about. I mean, the cultural language we had was very much about being working class and about being for them aspirational. You know, and I guess batting above your belt, you know, and yet we still feel it's batting above your belt. We were saying this earlier. You know, you're still pinching yourself. You're still thinking, oh, bloody hell, you know. He's like, bloody hell, I've got a Lamborghini, all get me. You know, bloody hell, I'm running a production company, we're running a TV company, we're making incredible programs, and you do still, it's that level of expectation that never leaves you, that level of non-expectation that never leaves you.
I do think it gives you, sorry.
Go, Tom, please.
I do think it actually sort of put on a positive of being working class, especially for me. I think if you're in a fight, I think for me, I look at sort of my background and from a very young age, I sort of knew what it was to sort of just survive, just get by, you know, go to work, you know, as you've said, you know, get to the end of a month, not have enough money, and live, like when people, you know, since I've been in media, you know, and you hear people say, "Oh, I'm skint," and you realise skint is still 700-800 quid in there. Okay, skint for me, you know, and there's those
skint is I can't go to Barcelona this weekend.
yeah. I mean, there was never any of that, but actually, I look at now. My work ethic is I run a production company now with 2 other guys that we made Murder and Success for with. We're pushing people from, I work into film, I work with the Blacklist to bring people through from working class backgrounds to come and work with us. Because if we're talking about bias, I'm not going to work every day with someone who's from Cambridge or from Eton, because, you know, I'll clash, that's my problem, that's the chip on my shoulder. But the big push for me is always going to be just to get in. I was working from 7 in the morning till 5, 6, if I wanted to live, that's what I had to do. So I could never believe when I got into this industry, some people who would like, you know, if I get a script commission, that you better believe that will be done in a week, 2 weeks. I'll bang, you know, I'll work as hard as I've got because I know how hard it is to get.
But that's, I mean, the thing you're touching on there, which is the most important thing in this, is we know we're producers, most people here, and, you know, we've got the Curve Foundation at Curve where we help disadvantaged people into the industry. I'm sure Jazz does similar things. We go out of our way, you're going out of our way. Actually, it's about money. And not only about money, but money is very important. And the broadcasters who are becoming very aware, if not fully aware, of what the situation is and problems is, need to put money into schemes whereby they make it, and the accessibility matters too, that we're out there saying, you could do this career, because we were talking before, you don't even think about it as a career if you're working class. You don't think that television is a career you could have. I don't think it was a career, and I was from a middle class background. So I think it's very hard to get the message out there, that first. But secondly, there has to be money behind actually funding people through their first stages of the career, because you're paid nothing. I was paid $6,000 a year in my first year in telly. How could I have done that if I didn't have middle class parents? It just would never have happened. Absolutely. Internships, we fund our internships at Curve, but, you know, actually that's really hard for a small independent company. We're not a big broadcast. We don't have millions and millions of pounds behind us to do that. And I'm sure that all of us here are trying to do the same thing, but it needs to come from the broadcasters.
And Paul, go on.
It does. I was just going to say, and I think I agree totally on that. I think money needs to be put in that, but I think it also needs to recognise that not all these voices are in and around London. So I had to win an award before a production company came to have a meeting with me in Manchester. So if you're a new writer and you're trying to meet these people, and you're trying to also, as you're a production company, you're trying to find writers outside London, when are you going up? When are you having conversations? When are they being told there's jobs beyond being there's jobs beyond being the celebrity on TV? You know, what are those other jobs that are underneath that they could have the skill set for? They're probably just not aware.
But that's the intersectionality. That's why being regional, we've got Curve Wales, we've had it for 3 years now. It's essential to be regional. It's essential. You can't do everything. Not everyone can do everything.
And obviously the Channel 4 move is going to be interesting to see where they, you know, if they end up in Birmingham and other places. Let's talk. We've talked to, and you've just touched on it there, Tom, about unconscious bias. That's the sort of term for it, isn't it? Where you all, you know, it's natural, isn't it? You appoint or you are drawn towards people who remind you a bit of yourself. And we've got Josh here, who is going to come up and you're going to talk to us a bit about it, because at the end of the day, we want to take something away from this, don't we? Because, you know, we've shared our experiences, but actually part of it is about what we do next.
Hiya. You all right?
Sorry. Hiya, my name's Josh WILLACY and I am here from Challenge. And I'm here to talk to you about class and social status. So, we are going to do a test. It's a implicit association test.
It's not on the app, is it? Because the app's not working.
It's not on the app, so it will involve audience participation, so get ready. But not much. Essentially, this test was developed in the 80s by Masreen Banerjee and Anthony Greenwald. And essentially, it was at the kind of brink of revolution around psychology and our unconscious mind. And it was a way in which to test what's going on in our unconscious mind. So, if you go on Harvard and you type in implicit association, or you go on Project Implicity, you can do these tests on everything from age to size to race, but there hasn't been one done publicly on class or social class. So we've developed this. So it's a Google have done something similar around gender and STEMs, but this is the first time that this has been done publicly. And so let's see how it goes, really. Right, so it's really simple. You're going to see some categories up on the screen. Oh, there's me. Sorry. One I took earlier. So if you, so you've got two categories. So if the word in the middle of the screen you associate with working class, raise your left hand and say left. All right?
Which is my left hand.
And that's your
There.
left, isn't it? Yeah.
Can you see it there? There.
And if the word that you see in the middle of the screen you associate with middle or upper class, I want you to raise your right hand and say right. Okay? How's that sound? That's pretty simple, isn't it? Okay,
The
so
Guardian.
Got it.
Say the Guardian in town.
first one.
Posh. No. Right.
There we go.
Sort of the
Left.
You're going the wrong way.
Right.
No, that's right.
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 Left. I don't know.
Okay.
Right. Oh, left. Right. Left.
No idea what
Oh, smashed it.
Too
Right.
fast for my brain.
Precarious.
Okay.
You were just like,
All right, so we're going to mix it up a little bit. And the
easy
two
one.
categories
Oh, that
are
was easy.
blue collar and professional. All right, so
Left,
oh God, I don't know. Right.
left,
Left. Left. Right. Right. Left.
right.
Right. Left. I don't know.
Yeah.
Left.
all right. Yeah, okay, you're getting the hang of it. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to cross the categories. So let's see how we go with this. So if you see a word in the centre that relates to working class or blue collar, then raise your left hand and say left. And if you see a word that you associate with middle class or professional, I want you to raise your right hand and say right. So let's see how we go.
Right. Left. Left. Right. Left. Right. Left. Left. Right. Right.
Right, can you tell what we're going to do next? We are going to cross them over again and see how we go. So, if you see a word that you associate with working class or professional, I want you to raise your left hand. And if you see a word that you associate with middle or upper class or blue collar, I want you to raise your right hand. So let's see how we go.
Very true. Wow. It could be very good. Clever.
Come on, where are you?
Yeah, that's clever. That is clever.
Yeah.
It's clever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Damn you, Josh.
I'm literally seeing about two hands here. And I think that really illustrates the point that
Really good.
any more for any more.
No.
So the reason we think we find this so difficult is because actually we're so used to seeing middle class people and upper class people doing these professional roles and working class people doing these blue collar roles, which means when we see things all the time, we have these neural pathways. So it makes it easy to make those assumptions, which is fine. This is a test. This doesn't really impact on anybody, but those stereotypes, assumptions can have an impact when we are editing something or when we're commissioning something or when we're recruiting for something, because so much of, we are defined by class in this country. I think Britain is particularly, it has its own class system, which is so expansive. This is very binary, as this test has to be, working and middle class. But obviously, class is incredibly complex in this country. But what that means is that we do feed into our biases, our prejudices, really easy, because so much of this industry is about what's the right fit, what's going to work, and that's where these biases can really matter. So there's a really famous study or test in unconscious bias. In the 50s, about 5% of musicians in orchestras were women. And the Boston Symphony Orchestra in 1952 decided to do a social experiment where they would make sure that all auditionees were behind a screen. So there wasn't that bias. There was no real immediate change until they asked all participants to take off their shoes, because the click of the heels on the hardwood floor were actually enough to give the women away. So what actually happened? Well, women were 50% more likely to progress through the preliminary, and actually the membership of the orchestras of women grew by 3%. I mean, 3 times, 300%. So what does that tell us? Well, there was obviously a perception that men played differently to women, better. And there's that perception that we see all the time, that perhaps middle and upper class people consistently, when asked, there's a perception that they may be more competent, more talented, more skilled, or more educated at certain roles, which actually we know to also not be the case. So we have to challenge those perceptions. We have to challenge those negative stereotypes that actually we see. But we don't just get these stimuli from the people around us. We get them from television. We get them from the media that we consume. So actually, as what's been touched on today, it's not just, we have to be critically reflective as content makers, as well as just general members of society. So, first things first, I'm not saying that you're all hugely classist or that there's a hidden snob in all of us. We all have our biases. That's the filter in which we see the world. It's actually about being critically reflective and understanding that. So yeah, they happen within a millisecond. So it's just, how do we challenge that? How do we think about it? So these are the tips that I would offer. Sorry, this is some of the science. So yeah, the neurological pathways. We have to rebuild them. We have to think about new pathways. So surround yourself with diverse people. And this goes beyond, like we said, class really does intersect. So I could be, well, I'm mixed race of Jamaican descent, but I could be middle, upper or working class. Same with disability. Actually, class is something socioeconomic we have to think about across equality strands. Open up conversations. The fact we're all in this room says that you're conscious and you're aware of these conversations, but would you go back to your team and talk about class? And would your team be able to feel confident about talking about where they're from, who they are, and actually talk in the accent that they do, their regional accent, without fear of ridicule, or talk about their own experiences without fear of ridicule. Understand your privilege. Often we think about privilege, we all have privilege, but think about where you are and what you can do to actually open the door for others. Consider your pathways to recruitment. As the research shows, we like getting that initial foot in the door often does take the bank of mum and dad, which just isn't an option to so many people. So how do we actually work our way around that, particularly, like you said, when money is sparse? Get counting, so think about what you see on screens. Who's the representation? Are they reflective and are they diverse across class? So we do like to feed into these stereotypes, but that is what builds in the public's mind, particularly when we think about poverty porn and things like that, which is really dangerous. Stop and think. Just actually, we're more likely to rely on these stereotypes when we're tired, when we're stressed, and when we're low on sugar. So if that's not an excuse to eat cake, I don't know what is. And watch box sets. So as creators, ensure that what you're consuming is diverse and that you are actually looking at authentic representation from across the class spectrum as well, and actually ensuring that if you don't surround yourself with people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, that you're consuming meaningful, authentic content, so you do have a greater understanding of the experiences of other people. Right, that's me.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Josh. We're going to end now, but just as you were talking there, it reminded me of this situation. Only about a year ago, I was in ITN, and a really well-known Channel 4 news presenter came into the makeup chair, and the girl who was doing it was new. She was from Manchester, and bizarrely, the presenter said to the makeup artist, what do your parents do? It's a really weird thing to say when you're not in school, sort of thing. Anyway, and she goes, oh, my dad's a surgeon. And the presenter said to the makeup artist, were your parents really disappointed that you chose to be a makeup artist? And this makeup artist told me, and she left not long after. She said, I don't feel I fit in here. I don't like being spoken to like that. It was astonishing to me. And this was somebody that I know quite well and it just shows you that just a comment, just your internal bias that your parents must be disappointed that you're doing that job then. Anyway, I think what you just said there was fascinating, actually. We all do it, we all have it. Yeah. It's time to leave, but I just want to leave with just one final thought from each of you, if you have a final thought. Tom, for us all, just...
As I was saying to you before, I think, actually, it's not a quick fix problem that we can do here, but actually I think it's a problem that, and I'll go into schools, I do some bits and bobs where I talk, and actually, at school I was dyslexic, I had ADHD, and actually a thing that's a lot of creative people don't perform in school. They're not going to be the kids who are going to do amazing in their GCSEs, and you can give up. I was given up on by teachers at a very young age. Literally thought I was ridiculous. They thought I'd even be a qualified scaffolder. So the truth of it is, we need to be sort of starting this at a very very young level, and telling kids that they can achieve, they can come into the industry that I'm working in now. That all of us, we're all doing. Yeah. And the big thing is, I think for kids, is just giving them a bit of hope. And I think then, 10, 15 years, we'll all be cracking on.
Great point, Camilla.
Be self-aware, and the broadcasters, it's time to put your money where your mouth is.
Paul?
I think I don't want to think we've come across as really negative today. There's lots of really good stuff out there, so I think some really good content and people are doing it really well, so don't just think we have to rewrite the rule book here.
I think it's about dedication, education, aspiration and money. I think things like the Alpha Fund, I think regional quotas upping, I think put money where your mouth is.
Until obviously we make adjustments to the various things that we've discussed, I also think that regardless of whether it's fair or not, people from these sort of backgrounds need to try and be resilient in the face of the difficult comments they might hear, because really it's on us to really just make an incursion into the culture rather than hope that it will be configured in a way that's personally pleasing to us. And I know that's not fair, but that's just the way it is.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I think they've been amazing. Thank you so much. Tom, Camilla, Paul.